טוב, כבר 3 דקות אחרי 2, אז אני חושב שאנחנו נתחיל, גם אם זה בלי הדר, והוא יצטרף
תשלח לו אולי את הקישור ששלחתי לך בוואטסאפ, שינסה משם. זה מה שהיה לי. הנה הוא.
אוקיי. אוקיי, לא, זה בסדר, הוא פה. כן.
כן.
היי הדר,
I
are you ready?
am. I don't know. I tried it off of a different link, and it worked. So
Okay,
whatever.
so you're going to stay in the background just with your photo on, right?
Yeah,
אוקיי, חגית, אנחנו מוכנים.
and I will. In
אני...
general, I will be here, but the reason I'm doing this is, and Hagit, apologies. My dad is having some medical issues, and I may need to take a call during this. So if you say something to me and I don't answer, it's because I had to step away for a moment.
All right, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, we're live, and we're also live on YouTube if you'd like to watch it there, and we're ready to start with our webinar. Thank you for joining this webinar. We're with Hagit Ofran of Shalom Achshav Settlement Watch Project. This is another webinar in our series on West Bank annexation. Hagit is joining us from her home in Jerusalem, where the time is 9 p.m. You may hear some background noises, very sweet noises of kids. Thanks for joining us at this late hour, Hagit.
Thank you.
It's
Not late enough for my baby, but yeah.
right, exactly. Hagit has been with Shalom Achshav with Peace Now for many years. She's considered as one of the leading authorities, if not the leading authority, on West Bank settlements and on settlements in East Jerusalem, which is one of the topic that we'll address today. She's been documenting the gradual de facto annexation in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, and has recently authored a report on an aspect of this phenomenon of annexation, which we'll discuss today at quite some length. Our webinar today focuses on one way in which Israel has been taking over Palestinian property in an area that has been annexed to Israel in East Jerusalem, annexed right after the 1967 war. And then what we'll try to do is examine how that practice might be implemented now in parts of the West Bank if Israel does go ahead and annex them. The topic we'll discuss today is somewhat complicated. It's a junction where history meets politics and law. So, knowing Hagit, I'm confident that she will aptly navigate us through this junction and up the path, up the road to help us better understand how annexation could cause more dispossession and misery and push both Israelis and Palestinians farther from peace. Before I ask Hagit to start, 2 comments. We're recording this webinar. The audio will be available on our website as an episode. I'm sorry, on our website and as an episode on Peacecast, our podcast. The other comment is that you're welcome to post questions for Hagit. You can use the Q&A tool. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen, and I'll go over it and relay your questions to Hagit. And with that, the floor is yours, Hagit. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And good evening from Jerusalem. What we are going to discuss today is the application of the use of the absentee property law in East Jerusalem, and this very specific topic is because it has a great impact on the settlement in East Jerusalem, and I believe that it can tell us a little bit about dynamics that may happen in the annexation, and it's also relevant to things that are happening today in East Jerusalem. So, Ori, if you don't mind to start the slideshow. I would like to tell you about the family, the Sumarin family. They are living in Silwan, which is Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. Here now you can see a picture of parts of the family in their house in Silwan. And if you look carefully, you can recognize that behind them is Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, which is the holiest place for the Jews in the world, the Temple Mount. And this mosque is the third in holiness for the Muslim world. And if you want, it is the volcanic core of our conflict. And this family is one of the victims of the story of the use of the absentee property law in East Jerusalem. And in our report that we recently published, we are trying to explain or to tell the story of this law in East Jerusalem. So, Ori, please. The law, you can press. The law, the absentee property law, was legislated in 1950, and it says mainly that Palestinian properties that, or Palestinian properties that belong to Palestinians who left the country during the 48 war, the government can make use of them. There is a custodian for absentee property, and the custodian declares property as absentee, and then it may be used by the government and sold to third parties, and etc. So if you look at the map of 48, or the end of the war in 48, all the red dots that you see in the map are communities, villages, towns of Palestinians that were destroyed, abandoned, whatever you want to call it. But the fact is that during that war, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians lost their houses and their lands and ran away. And the context of the legislation of the law was the context of a new country that was just established with hundreds of thousands of dunams that, or actually millions of dunams, that belongs to Palestinians who are not here, and tens of thousands of houses, 45,000 houses, shops, other properties. What do we do with all this? And how can we build our country with so many properties that belong to third parties that are not here? And of course, one of the decisions of the government at the time was not to allow the return of the Palestinians to their homes or to their lands, and therefore the government had to do something with those properties. So maybe one can find justification to such an extreme law that is actually denying ownership from people only because they ran away from the war. And in order not to apply this law on Jews or Israelis, for instance, if I would leave and go to study abroad, the custodian of absentee property will not be able to take my apartment. And the way the law was legislated was that only those properties of people who left to countries of enemies or enemy countries. And this way, you can define Palestinians without saying that it's only for Palestinians. And so this is a law that is in our law system in Israel. It was used and it's still being used in Israel. But then came 1967, and Ori, please give us the next slide. In 1967, Israel, as you know, occupied all the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And in this map, you can see the green line. In green, you can see in blue West Jerusalem. And the old city is marked in the brown area, which is the Jordanian Jerusalem. And all the brown areas are the Palestinian villages, cities around it. And in 67, the government of Israel decided to unilaterally annex some land around East Jerusalem. And Orish, can you show this? Here, that's the red line here. This is the annexation line. And just one remark, this annexation was done by a government decision that was taken 3 weeks after the war in June 67, without legislation in the Knesset. So theoretically, if the government wants today to annex, they can do it just by a cabinet decision. They don't need to go through the Knesset and legislate. That's in brackets. And if they would want to do it, actually, today, Netanyahu has a majority for annexation, both in his government and in the Knesset. So he can choose what he wants, God forbid. So what Israel did in East Jerusalem, in this 70 square kilometers around the old city, if you want, is to declare it part of Israel and to say this is the undivided city of Jerusalem, and to make sure that it will never be divided again. And one way to do it was to settle and to build settlements in the annexed area. And Ori can show us the next map. And here you can see the settlements that were added in after 67 in Jerusalem, that are basically what Israel did was to take all the empty areas that are not built. It's not all of it, but it's a lot. It's 1/3 of the annexed areas, and to confiscate it for the public use. And this public use was the construction of neighborhoods for Israelis. And the idea was to circle East Jerusalem and not to allow it to connect with the West Bank with those settlements, and in order to maintain Israeli control over it forever. At least that was the idea. And applying the laws, so what we see is that expropriation or confiscation is one of the things that are allowed in Israel for public use. It is not allowed in occupied territories because, as an occupier, we're not allowed to confiscate land for the use of the Israeli public, only for the use of the occupied people or for security reasons. So officially, Israel is not supposed to be confiscating lands in the West Bank. And if we annex, we can use it. So that's another point or another implication of annexation. Now to the next slide. But although, excuse Eyal, although the Israeli law was applied in East Jerusalem, it was not clear what to do with the absentee property law. And Ori, can you press another one? In 1968, there was a meeting in the Ministry of Justice with the Minister of Justice, with the Minister of Agriculture, and the legal advisor of the cabinet, and they decided there what to do with the absentee property law. And they actually said what was reasonable to say, that the law was meant for the very special circumstances of 48 that are not existed in 67 Jerusalem. There was no refugees that ran away and a lot of empty properties. It was just Israel applying the law on new land. So the decision was not to apply the law almost at all in East Jerusalem, except for specific cases where people are like in Israel. And I want to stress one of the things that they said, that if a home or a house is occupied, if there are people living there, they will not touch it at all. Okay, so that was the decision in '68, and it was the government of the labor. I don't know to what extent Eyal is interrupting. I will, excuse me for a second. I would like to see if I can make him a little
Go ahead, Hagit, it's fine.
Just a minute.
We're patient.
Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry, here I am. Okay, so that was a decision by the government. At the time, it was a labor government. And now, after a few years, you can skip to the next slide. In 1977, the Likud government was elected, and they had a different policy. In addition to the settlements that were around the Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem that we saw before, they started to settle in inside Palestinian neighborhoods in order to make sure that those Palestinian neighborhoods will become more Jewish, and therefore it will be harder to have a Palestinian capital of a Palestinian state in the future if, for instance, Silwan, which is south of the old city, becomes now more a Jewish neighborhood or more Jewish, and we are negotiating a peace deal, and the Palestinians are saying, well, Palestinian neighborhoods should be part of the Palestinian capital. Israel might say, well, it's not Palestinian, it's mixed or it's Jewish. So the idea was to bring as many Jews to live inside Palestinian neighborhoods, mainly in the old city, the Muslim quarter, and the surrounding neighborhoods. And in order to do that, they had to take over Palestinian properties. They had a few ways to do it. One of the ways was the use of the absentee property law. And all this was done behind the scenes without any publication within the Ministry of Housing under Ariel Sharon. A whole mechanism was set up to take Palestinian properties and to give it to settlers. And here you can go to the next slide. And in 1992, Rabin was elected as prime minister, and one of the first things they did was to nominate an investigation or a governmental committee to investigate what was done in East Jerusalem. And what they discovered, it was called the Klugman Report. Chaim Klugman was the head of this committee, and he was the head of the Ministry of Justice at the time. And this report showed how millions of shekels were given to settler organizations in order to allow them to take over Palestinian properties, how they used many kinds of laws in order to take over the Palestinian properties. And one of the things was the use of the absentee property law. And what was exposed was that the custodian of absentee property did not make any effort to check the status of the ownership. It was the settlers and the Jewish National Fund with Keren Kayemet, I will in a minute talk about it, to bring affidavits of Palestinian Palestinians from East Jerusalem that declare, oh, the owner of this specific house is an absentee, he lives in Jordan. And based on this affidavit, the custodian of absentee property declared that it is absentee property and then sold it to the Jewish National Fund. And now we can go to the next slide. When I looked for the Jewish National Fund, the Keren Kayemet L'Israel, in Wikipedia, this was the photo that you see. Maybe you are familiar with the boxes, the blue boxes that they collect donations from the Jewish people, and the forests in the background, which is what they are doing with this money. They're planting trees and dealing with the environment. The Jewish National Fund was established more than 100 years ago in order to help the Jewish people to establish a state in Israel by buying lands in the land of Israel. And in 1948, when Israel was established and there was no need anymore to buy lands for Jews in the land of Israel because we have a state already, unfortunately, the Keren Kayemet did not say, okay, we did our thing and now we can go home, but continued to exist and continued to own lands in Israel and continued to do things. But what they chose to do was mainly to deal with environmental issues and social issues, etc. However, in '67, some parts of the JNF saw themselves as if it's like before the establishment of Israel, and they started to try to buy lands in the West Bank, and they bought some land in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem, they helped. There were key factors in transforming or transferring properties from Palestinians to the settlers. And one of the things that we found in our research, and you can show the next slide, is a letter from the JNF in 1989 that is actually writing to the custodian of absentee property. Listen, there are some properties or attached is a list of properties that are absentee property. We would like you to declare them absentee property and then make sure that it goes to us. Meaning that the whole idea of the law that was that in some specific circumstances, the custodian may declare land as absentee and sell it to third parties in good faith. Here you see that the beneficiary, the person or the body that will later get the property is actually the one behind declaring it absentee. And in the list of those properties that are in Silwan, there was also the Soumarin family house. You can show a map of where the Soumarin family house is, and actually you saw it in the picture at the beginning, just south of the old city. And next to it, next to the house, the settlers established their center, visitor center of Silwan, what they call the City of David. And it was, by the way, established on land that belongs to the Soumarin family that was declared absentee. Or another angle to see where we are, you can see that, or you need to press again, I think, in order to see where the Soumarin house is. You can see it's a Palestinian neighborhood. You may be able to see that it's there is a visitor center next to it. And also you might see the old city walls on the right hand of the picture. And I want to say something about the specificalities of the Soumarin family. the declaration of Somarin as absentee was at the beginning. The affidavit said that the person, the owner, Musa Somarin, was absentee. And based on that, the JNF got the property, and in 1991, they sued the family and said, we own the house, you should go away. And the family said, but Musa, which was their uncle, okay? Musa died in 83 in his house in Silwan. He was never an absentee. So the court at the beginning said, you're right, it's all a scheme, it's not right, and they rejected the JNF's lawsuit. But when the JNF appealed to the district court, they came up with a new idea and said, well, maybe we were wrong and Musa wasn't absentee, but his children, he had 2 sons, they are absentees. And because of that, the court said, you know what? So it is absentee property. And the family is Somarin family, but they are not the official heirs of Musa. Musa was their uncle. They were living with their uncle and, you know, taking care of him when he was old. And suddenly the court said the house belongs to the JNF. And however, he did not allow the eviction because he said the family did get a permission from Musa to stay, and therefore they can stay. But then a few years later, the JNF renewed the lawsuit, and a few weeks ago, the district court refused their appeal, and they are supposed to be evicted from their house by August 16. They did ask to appeal in the High Court, but we don't know what will happen with that. And there is a very high chance that based on this scheme that the JNF was part of, the family might be thrown out of their house. And it's not only a human issue, you know, of a disaster for a family that 30 years are in court, start trying to save their home and eventually might be thrown out, but it's also a political matter. And as you know, we are very close here to the, what I said, the volcanic core of our conflict. And any eviction here has a big political effect. And, you know, another thing, the easiest way to stop it is if the JNF decides that they leave the family alone and say, this is not why the Keren Kayemet was established for, to kick out Palestinians from their house, and just to leave them. They can do it even if they win in court. Other ways would be the government. The government, you know, any eviction in East Jerusalem has to go through the approval of the government. The police needs to say that it's okay, etc. The government can stop it or delay it, and eventually, if they want, they can confiscate it. Or there are ways to stop it, but politically, it's very unlikely to be able to get the government to return the property to the family. So that's a very sad story, which is still ongoing. There were another few properties in Silwan, around 20 of them that were declared absentee property. It's okay, you can leave it. And only 7 of them were saved by the courts, and others were either still pending, like the Somarin family, or taken by the settlers. And another last thing, and in the Klugman Report, in the Rabin government, the government decided to stop this and to say it was wrong, we should not continue that, and actually went back to the 68 document that said, we are not really using the law in East Jerusalem. However, they did not undo the injustice and left the families to fight in courts by themselves. And also, after a few years, when there was Netanyahu or Sharon was the prime minister, we saw a return to some kind of abuse of the absentee property in East Jerusalem, but I will not go into the details of it right now. So this map, if you're familiar with that, this is the conceptual map that was presented by President Trump as the future annexation for Israel. And you can see in this map, the brown area is supposed to be for Palestinians. And I cannot call it a Palestinian state, although the American paper is saying a Palestinian state. But if you look at the map, you can see that this cannot be a viable state without any territorial continuity, etc. And even Netanyahu said, you know, in the Israeli radio a few weeks ago, the Americans may call it a state, but we all know it's not a state. And you can see in red or brown, oh, it's red, the lands that are supposed to be annexed to Israel. And you can see also in orange, some Palestinian communities, villages that are inside the annexed territory. Now, theoretically, if Israel applies the law, the Israeli law on this land, the absentee property law is part of the Israeli law. And Israel might say that the owners of those lands, most of them live in the brown areas that are supposed to be a non-state for the Palestinians. Israel might say, well, it's an enemy country, they're absentees, and therefore all their properties, and it's about 1/3 of the land that is considered private land, will or can be declared absentee property. However, I want to say that in my view, it's not the biggest threat of an annexation at all. And also I believe that definitely not at the beginning of the annexation, it will happen. The government may say, we're not planning to use the law in those lands, etc. But what we learn from Jerusalem is that this law is in the toolbox of the government. And if there is a political will or wish, they might use it or abuse it in order to dispossess Palestinians from their properties. So it's a threat, but it's not the main threat of annexation. And I would like to take a few more minutes just to elaborate a little more about the annexation and the bigger threats, in my view, of annexation. And one thing, you can show the next map. One thing I think that we're seeing is that the talks about annexations are now being played down, and maybe this Trump map is not going to be implemented, and we might go for a smaller annexation. And I think a smaller annexation is in some ways very big threat, or even a bigger threat to us, because if it's smaller, it is harder to oppose it. And I don't know if the next administration in the US, if it will be only annexation of what Israel call the settlement blocks. Will it be clear for the next administration that they are undoing it or not recognizing it. And the map that you see here is a map of proposed annexation in law, or a bill that did not pass, but it was, it passed only the first reading of annexation. The blue areas are the planned areas to be annexed. So in the Israeli public discourse, you're talking about Ma'ale Adumim. It's a settlement not far from Jerusalem, which is considered not controversial at all, as if it's part of Israel, etc. And it includes also what is called Gush Etzion, which is south of Bethlehem area. And these small areas that Israel might claim, well, you know, it's part of a potential land swap even we can do, and it's not destroying a Palestinian state, or etc. This could be a harder challenge for us to oppose. And why do I think we should oppose it so much? I would like to show you why I think that such annexation, even for a small amount of land, could be disastrous for a potential Palestinian state. And I'm focusing on E1 plan. And Ori, can you show us the E1? Okay, here. Here what you see is a look from Jerusalem to the east. Maybe you can see that the brown areas are the Palestinian neighborhoods. You can see Ma'ale Adumim in blue, which is an Israeli settlement. And E1 is to the left of it or north of it. And this photo or map shows that we're talking about an area which is crucial for the development of the Palestinian population, E1. It's not only, you know, cutting in the middle of the West Bank, but it's also essential for the potential growth of those neighborhoods. And please show us the next map, or another way to look at it. You see E1 is marked in the middle of this map, and the circles of 15 kilometers, 30 kilometers around it are circles of what will be reasonable for commuting, for instance. If you want to build a center for either housing or places to work or industry or whatever, you should have it in a normal way or a normal distance for development. And what also you can see that for the Israelis, E1 is actually not an advantage at all. Okay, it's not close, except for Jerusalem, but it's not even continual with Jerusalem. There are Palestinian neighborhoods between them, so it's not viable even for Israeli development. Also, I want to mention that East Jerusalem, the Palestinian East Jerusalem, is the largest city in the West Bank, and together with Ramallah in the north and Bethlehem in the south, this is the central metropolitan of the Palestinian state. And you cannot have this metropolitan to be viable or to evolve without a crucial part of land. And therefore, E1 is a big problem for a Palestinian state, for the two-state solution, etc. And another map, I think maybe the last map for E1 is another way to show why E1 is so essential specifically to the Palestinians, which are here in brown, and not essential for the Israel is in blue, and the old city in the middle. And I'm talking about E1 because in parallel to the talks about annexation, the government approved the plan in E1, and the plan is to build at the beginning around 4,000 units, but it's going to be a big city if it's going to be built. And Netanyahu, at the eve of the last elections, approved the depositing of this plan. And according to the planning process, we are at the stage of filing objections. And in Peace Now, we prepared an objection. Those maps are part of our objections, which is based on what we believe is the just way of, allocating the land to Palestinians and not to Israelis, and of course to maintain the chances for peace. And we are about to open a campaign and to ask people to join our objection, and I believe you will hear about it very soon. And I think this is the end of the slideshow. I want to conclude about what we can learn many things from East Jerusalem, and to the potential effect of annexation. But I think what is most important is that what the annexation might do to Israel is to end occupation and to start the apartheid. And why? Because even if Israel will say we are not, annexing people, we're not going to deny them their rights under Israel, we are denying their rights because they don't have a state, because they don't have where they can have their rights. And we control all of the West Bank today. And even if we annexed some of it and say the other parts are Palestinian state, we still control it. And it's not, and therefore, if Israel all the time could say it's temporary, it's occupation, which maybe it's not just or it's not democratic, but it's temporary, and we want to get to peace, and when it will be possible, we'll go to peace. Now what Israel is saying, we are here to stay. And if we're saying that, it means that we changed our regime from a democracy to an apartheid state, and that's horrible news for anyone who believes that the state of Israel should be a place that we deserve to live in. So now I'm ready to take your comments or questions.
Thank you, Hagit. We have quite a few questions and about 10 minutes. So what I'll try to do is to bunch up the questions and kind of ask them thematically. A couple of questions that we had have to do with the potential for applying the absentee property law to areas in the West Bank that will be annexed to Israel. So if we take the Trump plan and what the Trump plan says about potential annexation in the West Bank, what would be the potential there? In other words, how much land is there that Israel could apply that law to?
It's around 1/3 of the land, and it's about it's more than 500,000 dunams, which is 4 times in acres. So in acres, it should be like 150,000 acres.
But is there a way to know how much of that could fall under the definition of absentee?
If they decide that the Palestinian owners that live in the West Bank are absentees, then it's probably all of it, because Israel is saying we're not annexing the people, we're annexing the land, and the people will stay in the West Bank, like in Ramallah, in Bethlehem, wherever they live, but they might lose it. But also they might lose it, technically, because Israel will say you're not allowed in anymore. So you cannot access, or you need a permit, or Israel might confiscate it. So it's a disaster for them, for sure. But at the same time, Israel has been taking Palestinian lands and closing them down all the time, even without annexation. So it's bad enough already.
Another question, so we have several questions regarding the legal aspect of this law and so on. I'll ask you several questions in that context, and if you don't remember them, get back to me and ask me, and I'll repeat them. One is, why hasn't the law been applied to the West Bank so far? In other words, there are some lands in the West Bank that are that belong to people who are absentees. Why hasn't it been applied to the West Bank? The other question that we had here is, has this law been challenged in court before, in the Supreme Court in Israel, and what did the Supreme Court say about that? Maybe those questions at first.
In the West Bank, the Israeli law is not applied. It's occupation laws, it's military laws, and we are, as occupiers, are obliged to the existing law, which is the Jordanian law, and only are allowed to legislate only for the benefit of the Palestinians or for security reasoning, although Israel is doing many other things, but never legislated such a law that cannot be justified anyway. So it's not part of Israel, so this Israeli law is not applied. And the law, of course, has been in courts many, many times. And even recently, and even with regard to East Jerusalem, in the report that you can find online in our website at peacenow.org.il. I mean, if you do .org, you get to very good website, which is Americans for Peace Now. But if you add the IL, you get to Peace Now Israel, and you can find the report there. There is a whole episode about the ruling from 2015 about the absentee property law in East Jerusalem, which is a very important ruling that says that this law is so problematic that had it been legislated today, it would have been canceled, etc., etc. However, it's already legislated, etc., and it's the court is trying to limit the use of the law, but it's not enough in order to really block it.
We have a question here that sounds simple, but I know that the answer to it is not, and that is, why is it that there is so much land in the West Bank that Palestinians don't actually exercise their ownership of? In other words, don't live on or don't utilize for agricultural purposes.
First of all, this is a normal way in the world. If you go around, not only in Texas or in other places, you see that most of the land is not used. It's just land, but some is cultivated. Now, people live in villages and in towns, and they have land around it. Historically, the West Bank was based, the economy was based on quite a primitive agriculture. But in '67, when Israel opened the borders and people started to work in Israel and started to abandon the agriculture, and then in the '80s, Israel applied an interpretation of the existing law in the West Bank, saying that if the land is not cultivated, then it actually becomes property of the public, or in other words, state land, and therefore the land was taken by the Israeli authorities, and then allocated to the settlers for either agriculture or building of settlements. And this way, Israel already had taken 1 million dunam, or almost 1/5 of the West Bank already taken this way. But we are talking about more lands that were not taken yet.
How about challenges to the law by in the Supreme Court?
I said that there is a whole chapter in our report, and that
Okay.
the law is the law. The court in Israel has to rule according to the existing Israeli law, and they cannot just cancel this law today, unfortunately, and they never did that. But you can read in the report some of it.
We have a question regarding E1. Maybe I think that we'll probably make this the last question. If E1 remains open and can potentially be used by a future Palestinian state for contiguity, then obviously it serves transportational purposes for a future Palestinian state. But if in such a case, the question is, what would happen to contiguity between Israel and Ma'ale Adumim? I'm sorry, between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim.
Ma'ale Adumim, for instance, if you go to the Geneva Initiative, like the model of agreement that we have between Israelis and Palestinians, the Palestinians there accepted that Israel will annex Ma'ale Adumim, but not annex all the surrounding of Ma'ale Adumim, meaning that Ma'ale Adumim will be an enclave connected with the road to Israel, and that in order to maintain it and not to need to evict 40,000 people who live there. However, all the land around it will be for the benefit of the Palestinian state. Otherwise, if Israel is going to build this E1, we will need to evict it, or that there will not be peace or two states. And I did not, and I think maybe I should, if I may, say one thing because of the Beinart article and the two-state solution. I think the fact that it's so hard to see a potential two-state solution does not change the fact that this is the only solution that we have. The idea that we can live in one state together and have full equality is much, much, much harder, unfortunately maybe, but much, much harder than to get Israelis to evict the settlements. It's not that Israelis will get up in the morning and say, oh, occupation didn't work, so we'll give all the Palestinians the right to vote, and there will be a coalition in the Knesset with Likud and Hamas. This is not going to happen. If you're telling us that the two-state solution is dead, you're actually saying that we are going to have many, many years and decades of bloodshed or continuous oppression of the Jewish majority or the Jewish minority that we might be against the Palestinians. And it's bad news for Palestinians, bad news for Israel. And I really would want to ask Peter Beinart what made him change his mind. The fact that it's so hard to do it, is that means that it's not a good solution anymore? I don't think it's, nothing really changed except for it became harder. It's not that it's not the right solution. So that's my last comment.
Good, and I think this will be the last your last comment or the last tune of this webinar. We had a question, and I want to clarify that yes, a recording of this will be made available, and the maps that were presented in the PowerPoint that Hagit prepared will also make those available on our website. We always end our briefings with a word from Jim Klutznick, the chair of our board, who is with us, and if he can turn on his camera and microphone, we'll be able to hear him.
It's not
Are you
on?
with us, Jim?
Yes, I'm with you. I
Great.
don't know, I thought my camera was on, but, and I see a beautiful picture of Adar, but I guess I'll have to send a picture of George Clooney to my picture next time. At least my name's spelled right, so that's all right. So, yeah, I want to, first of all, I want to send my personal best wishes to you for this great presentation, Hagit, and love hearing your baby all the time and miss seeing you. Um, I think that those who've joined us today have heard from one of the great experts on this issue through Shalom Akshav's Settlement Watch program, which she created and continues to run with her associates at Shalom Akshav. I think you see what the real intent is here, and that is through this Byzantine with a small b, kangaroo court, Mad Hatter type of situation the Palestinians are put through with the help of and assistance of people in our country like the JNF. Uh, uh, just what they face in trying to gain statehood, which they're entitled to. And so we thank Shalom Akshav and Settlement Watch for constantly watching out for this. Hagit told you her honest opinion as to what happens here if we can't get this resolved, the many years of suffering that everybody will have to live under. So we ask you to please continue to support APN and Shalom Akshav in this effort to make sure that there are two sovereign nations living next to each other in peace. And that's what I'd like to leave you with today. Oh, one other thing. You've heard all of this. One, I would recommend a book that I read a number of years ago called The Lords of the Land by Akiva Elder and Edith Sertel. This is a good primer on this subject. And you'll read that and you'll hear the echoes of Hagit as she spoke today and the antecedents of what went on to create this tortured situation. It's just, it's reprehensible. Anyhow, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And Hagit, last word?
Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Oh, no, you know what? Don't
Yes,
give
go
up on
ahead.
us. Don't
No,
give up
never.
on us. We
Never.
cannot
We
give
never
up.
will. Great. Thanks again for everyone who joined us on this briefing. Again, as I indicated before, we'll have an audio of this prepared soon, and there will be a video recording as well. The PowerPoint slides will be shared with you as well. All of those who ask questions, and there are quite a few there, who still want to ask their questions of us, please send them to us. You can find ways to communicate with us through our website. Send them to me. I will either share them with Hagit or answer them myself. And that's it. We'll have some more briefings coming up soon. Thank you very much for joining us, and this ends our webinar. Thank you, Hagit, again. Bye, everyone.